Hello and welcome to this webinar sponsored by ASPA's section on democracy and social justice. And topic for today is social equity, diversity, and inclusion as ethical principles. It is part 5 of a 6-part ethics education series on ethics education. And this event is being recorded and we will post it to social media channels later. My name is Carissa Vincent and I serve as DSJ's Digital Engagement Coordinator. I will be remaining off camera for the duration of the event as it helps making the video editing go more smoothly. In terms of logistics, there will be a Q&A segment later in the event, so please send your questions and or comments directly to me. Now, before introducing this webinar and the panelists as well as moderator, we would like to draw your attention to another web series as we are co-hosting, namely the 3rd annual Social Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion series, which you can see here now. And this event would have been held at ASPA 2020 in Anaheim this year if the conference hadn't been canceled due to COVID. So I just want to draw your attention to October 27th of this month, which is next week, and Dr. Stephen Panelists will be discussing incorporating SETI into mission plans and performance management. And then on December 9th, Dr. Richard Greggory Johnson III will discuss weaving SETI into the curricula. And these events are always free and open to everyone, so we encourage you to share widely. We will be sharing RSVP links with you in the chat shortly. So without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Richard Greggory Johnson, our moderator for this webinar. Now, Dr. Johnson is a fully tenured professor and department chair for the Department of Public and Nonprofit Administration at the School of Management, University of San Francisco. Dr. Johnson also serves as chair of USF's Institutional Review Board. As a scholar, Professor Johnson's research centers on social equity within the fields of public policy, management, higher education, and human resources management. He has been teaching in higher education for almost 20 years and is widely published with several peer-reviewed books and over 24 peer-reviewed journal articles. Dr. Johnson holds graduate degrees from Georgetown University, Golden State University, and DePaul University. Professor Johnson is also a life member of Alpha Pi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated and holds membership in the following honor societies, including Pi Beta Kappa, Pi Gamma Mu, and Pi Alpha Alpha. And finally, he is running for ASPA President-elect. So, Dr. Johnson, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. I say good morning because it is yet morning here in California, but I would like to welcome again, as Patricia mentioned, everyone to this exciting panel. We have quite a group of panelists this morning, and they are going to tell us everything that we want to know about teaching social equity in the classroom. And so without further ado, I'm going to now introduce them. And I'm going to be reading from my script, of course, because I don't want to leave anything out for any of our panelists. First, we're going to start with Dr. Vanessa Lopez-Littleton, who is an associate professor of public administration and nonprofit management and chair of the Department of Health, Human Services, and Public Policy at California State Monterey Bay. Dr. Lopez-Littleton actively participates in designing innovative graduate and undergraduate programs, works with diverse teams to develop inclusive classroom and academic practices, and serves as a consultant on nonprofit leadership and management. Dr. Lopez-Littleton's research interests include health inequities, the social determinants of health, and racial equity. And on a more personal note, I am so pleased that I have the great opportunity to work with Dr. Lopez-Littleton in our San Francisco Bay Area ASPA chapter, where she routinely puts on programs that are just fabulous. For example, she just coordinated and executed an exciting voter education program that was well received, and it was, of course, very timely. So again, welcome, Dr. Lopez-Littleton. Our next panelist is Kareem Willis, who is a doctoral student at the School of Public Affairs and Administration at Rutgers University, Newark. Through his research, Kareem explores the underlying social equity and social justice issues and concerns, broadly defined, within public administration, public management, and nonprofit management, leadership, and philanthropy. And we are just excited to have this young scholar on our panel. And I believe that we can rest knowing that the field of public administration will be well represented with scholars, upcoming scholars like Kareem, who are interested in social equity and making our field and our global community a more equitable society. Welcome, welcome, Kareem. Dr. Jeannine Love is an associate professor of public administration and program director of the political science at Roosevelt University in Chicago. Her research focuses on integrative approaches to radical democracy and governance, social movements, organizations in the classroom. Her most recent book, co-authored with Margaret Stout, is called Integrative Governance, Generating Sustainable Responses to Global Crisis. Congratulations on your most recent book, Dr. Love. Um, she brings this theoretical lens for and inclusive discussion in the classroom and grounding course content in examinations of racial, social, and economic justice. And again, on a more personal note, it's always good to be around someone that knows Chicago. And delighted to, over the years, have known many people from Roosevelt University as I graduated from DePaul, which is, I believe, sort of right down the street or up the block or something like that. So welcome, Dr. Love. Moving on to Dr. Aaron C. Rollins, Jr., who is an associate professor and vice chair of the Department of Urban and Public Affairs at the University of Louisville. He directs both the Master of Public Administration program, as well as the Peace, Justice, Conflict, and Conflict Transportation program. He is a Prince-Hall affiliated Mason, and I also take great pleasure in saying that he is my fraternity brother of the Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity incorporated. And to my fraternity brother, I say 06. Finally, moving on, I'm also pleased to announce that Dr. Rollins was recently voted as the next department chair of Urban and Public Affairs at the University of Louisville. So congratulations, Dr. Rollins. We are so thrilled for you, and we rest knowing that your department will be in fine hands. So congratulations to you. Finally, but certainly not lastly, we have someone who is new in our profession, and we welcome him here to this panel and to our profession. We're thrilled to have him, Dr. Jose Luis Irizarry, who is a doctoral dissertation fellow at the University of Illinois, Springfield, where he teaches graduate courses in nonprofit management. He earned his PhD in public administration from Florida Atlantic University. And again, we say congratulations as he just wrapped things up with his dissertation. So honestly, he shouldn't be on this panel now. He should still be out celebrating, but we're glad that he has taken some time to be with us today. So welcome, Dr. Irizarry. I also want to mention just a little bit more about him. His interests are public administration values and theory, public service, nonprofit, pedagogy, criminal justice, and policy analysis. Dr. Irizarry served on ASPA's National Council as the first ASPA student representative and later as a District 1 representative. He has taught courses in public administration public administration, criminal justice, and nonprofits in 5 universities in New York, Florida, and Illinois. And again, on a more personal level, Dr. Zari is one of my homeboys from the Bronx, New York. So always excited to be around another New Yorker in our great field of public administration. So welcome, panelists. Thank you all for serving on the panel today. We're going to get going. And the first question I'm going to ask, everyone will get a chance to answer, and it will be in the order of how I read your bios, please. And so we're going to start first with Dr. Lopez-Littleton. Principles related to social equity, diversity, and inclusion are part of ASPA's Code of Ethics, and similar principles are evident in other professional associations' Code of Ethics as well. Given ongoing issues such as racism, white supremacy, and more, what should public administration do to make DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion principles more realized as ethical principles?
Yeah, so thank you, Dr. Johnson, for that question. I think that is an incredible question, one that I think that a lot of folks have been grappling with. So I won't get too far into ethics, the ethics of it, but what I will say is that I think that DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think that they are aligned with ethical duties, thinking about what one ought to do, not only for the individual, but for the good of the society, and that consideration of well-being of all those affected individuals. I think that, of course, there's room for scholarship in this area. One of the criticisms of some of the work that we do in DEI work is that a lot of the work is founded under with the basis of critical race theory. And what's happening right now is that there is an effort to undermine or overturn a lot of the work that has been done over the last couple of years in advancing anti-Black racism and lots of other types of racism. And so one of the things that needs to happen almost immediately is some pushback to that executive order that was signed by the president on combating race and sex stereotyping. I think that as a nation, we are grappling with what our values are and how inclusive we are willing to be. And this EO is kind of like antithetical to all of the work that we've been doing over the last several decades in advancing social equity and also diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so, from my purview, I think that there are some things that need to happen almost immediately. One relates to the depoliticization of Black Lives Matter. For some reason, it has now become, it's framed in a way that we're saying Black Lives Matter, but no one else's lives matter. And that could be, so far from the truth. I'll speak just briefly about what Black Lives Matter actually is about, because it's about police violence against Black and brown people. And why that is so important in public administration is because law enforcement officers, by their very nature, are public administrators and they're street level bureaucrats, whereby they dispense justice out on the streets in their interactions with their citizens. And so by their very nature, the relationships that they have with the people, it's now at a place where we are trying to understand what is the best way to proceed. There is a lot of tension between law enforcement officers and communities of color, things that need to, in a strategic way, need to be addressed if we're going to move forward in a inclusive environment. And so having leaders and people, senior administrators, actually have the wherewithal to acknowledge that systemic racism is real. And the reason that I say that it's real, it's because how can it not, based on the history of this country, where we had a group of folks who were enslaved, they were freed without any kind of restitution for the atrocities inflicted upon those people. So there's historic precedent in the way that people have been treated in their experiences and where we are now. And without intentional efforts to provide that group of people with what they need in order to be successful, then we end up in a place where we have people who feel like second-class citizens in the United States. And so I know this is a lot of stuff to unpack in such a, but that was a really good question. So I'm looking forward to hearing my colleagues comment on it as well. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lopez-Littleton. That was such an insightful response. And knowing you as I do, I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised. You always provide us with such meaty type of things that we can ponder as the day goes on. So thank you for that. We're going to now turn the same question over to Kareem Willis. Kareem, if you would respond, please.
Thank you. I want to say thank you to Ask with DSJ for having me as part of this. Can you guys hear me? You can hear me, right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, awesome. I was thinking about the question and I wanted to keep my answer as simple as possible. And forgive me if it sounds extremely personal. I really like to come from a place of like I statements. And I think what I've recognized since I've been a part of public administration as a student and with some experience on the teaching. And I think there's a certain level of intentionality that we lack in public administration when it comes to teaching DEI as ethical principles and so on. And that's something that I've been trying to be more mindful of in my own work. And when I speak of intentionality, I think about how when I wanted to get involved with public administration and how I was excited to be a part of the field, I immediately recognized if really women meaning well until and quickly forgetting that racists, sexist, and bigots do get PhDs as well. And they do end up in academia, and they do end up in offices that are supposed to be of that are supposed to serve and ensure a certain quality of life for individuals. And so it's kind of having to unlearn that and not leaving so much to chance and not relying so much on our taken for granted assumptions that I think will really help us to get to that point of making DEI principles more realized as ethical principles.
That was great. That was such a insightful response. And again, I just felt the personalness of it. So thank you for sharing your thoughts with us on that question. Now turning to Dr. Love, if you would respond to the same question, please.
Sure, and I always love being part of these webinars because the folks who come before me are like, oh, these are great extra things to think about, and I think good contextualization for what I wanted to say, which is one of the things that stuck out to me as I was reading this question was that it kind of answers itself in that it starts out with talking about social equity, diversity, and inclusion, right, SETI, and then talks about DEI, and then says, given ongoing issues of racism, white supremacy, and more, right? And what really sticks out to me there is the fact that language matters, right? We've been talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. There's lots of good conversations, important conversations about the distinctions between those terms. We have pushed, right, in public administration, there's been a lot, and I don't want to undercut, I want to actually call out and lift up all of the really important work that has been done to move us from equity to social equity, right? And to get the, call for social equity to be considered one of the, the foundation and not just a pillar in PA, right? And I could list off all of the amazing folks that have been doing that work. But at the end of the day, right, social equity is still really, really vague, right? And so I went and I looked at the ASPA principles too, just to sort of think about like, where do those fit in? In principle, the ethical, principles, principle 3 says, promote democratic participation. But it uses language of informing the public, which isn't necessarily inclusion, right? Like we have to work to get to the point of inclusion from that. It's principle 4 is strengthen social equity, but in the discussion it talks about equality, never really talks about what equity is. And to get to the points I think, that Vanessa and Kareem were making so nicely was that if we just talk about social equity, Okay? We're not naming the systems of oppression that exist, right? That are built into public administration, that are built into our public service organizations. So, right, if we want to think about social equity and how we can promote that as ethical principle in the face of white supremacy and systemic racism, we need to name white supremacy and not just say of social equity. If we're going to talk about white supremacy, we also need to name anti-Blackness, right? Because white supremacy manifests itself in myriad ways, right? And anti-Blackness is a specific form or specific kind of history and manifestation of white supremacy. Similarly, right, we need to name the oppression of LGBTQ plus folks, but at the same time, that's still a vague conversation, right? If we want to get at the specific forms of oppression that trans folk are experiencing, we need to name that, right? So we need to move beyond just talking about social equity, diversity, and inclusion to talk about specific forms of oppression that are inside our institutions, in public administration itself. Because one of the things that I worry about is if we just talk, in terms of social equity, each one of us gets to read into that what social equity means. And we then are very likely to, maybe social equity to me means anti-racism and addressing white supremacy in all its forms, but I'm not paying attention necessarily to ableism, for instance, right? Or the oppressions that trans folk are experiencing, or, et cetera, right? So if each of us reads what we want into social equity because it's vague, then we never get to the specificity that we need to actually implement the ethical, changes that we need. And to Vanessa's point about the executive order, I hadn't really thought about this until you were just talking about Vanessa. And I said, I feel like that's driving some of that pushback, right? In the executive order, is that we are moving beyond just talking about equity vaguely and saying, like, no, white privilege exists, white supremacy exists, anti-Blackness is an issue we need to directly address, and then that gets that pushback. So I will close with that.
Thank you, Dr. Love. That was such an awesome comment. And what I particularly enjoyed about what you were saying is this notion of naming it, right? Because that's what's being left out in so many of our conversations. We're apprehensive or leery about naming the oppression. And I think until we start doing that, things will be slow to change. So thank you so much for your sage comments. And now we will follow up with Dr. Rollins, who will address the same question, please.
Yes. I also want to thank ASPA for putting on this panel. I appreciate you all for including me in this conversation. This organization has afforded me so many opportunities to meet some of my favorite people in this world, next to my mom and grandmother. But I've met some sheroes in this field. I've met the Susan Goodens and the Brandy Blesses and the Tia Gaynors and the Barbara Patrick. So I really want to appreciate this organization for that reason. But my answer piggybacks off Jeannine's answer. I think in order to accomplish this goal, public administration needs to do some introspective thinking. And they need to do some introspective analysis and see where are we falling short as public administrators. We've seen this, we've read these stories for years, but I feel it's our moral obligation to really see where we're falling short. I think it was in 2013, Tia Gaynor and Corrales, they wrote an article saying, hey, we're not writing about these issues. We're not writing about diversity in the major public administration journals. And we did nothing about it. I mean, I think if she did a restatement of that same journal, she'll probably find the same answers. After Hurricane Katrina, Camilla Stivers wrote an article, So Poor, So Black, one of my favorite articles, to just really hit the nail on the head. When she talked about bureaucratic discretion and racism and how it manifested as the result of Hurricane Katrina. And we did nothing about it. I mean, as an organization, just continue. But I think we first must do some introspective thinking and have these tough and uncomfortable conversations in our classrooms, in our curriculums, and in our journals. I mean, I think we should really call public administration to the table. The second thing I think we should do is do what Susan Gooden told us to do in her book, talk race. Let's stop sugarcoating it. I mean, you're talking about, Jeannine's talking about the naming things. I'm all about it. Susan Gooden told us years ago, hey, let's talk about race in our public administration. Let's have the conversations, the uncomfortable conversations about race, and simply say the things that we've been so scared to talk about for years. We always taught don't talk religion and politics. What we don't say is, truthfully, we've always taught, don't talk race, and don't call America out on its hypocrisy. We've been taught those things as well. And if we start doing those things, then and only then can people start going back into their inner circle. See, I tell my students all the time, I can teach you all this stuff. I can talk to my head fall out, but I will never reach some of the circles that you all can reach. When you go home for Thanksgiving, when you go home and have these conversations within your inner circles, you can have those conversations and really challenge your parents and challenge the pedagogy that you've been taught all of your life. So I think we need to have some introspective conversations and some tough conversations and really call public administration out for its willingness to continue a system that is oppressive to many of Americans and people around this world and country.
Thank you, Dr. Rollins. That was, again, so insightful. And I am so pleased that you referenced a number of our scholars in the field, such as Dr. Gooden and Jade Berry and all of those individuals who are continuing to make a difference by our scholarship. I mean, you didn't mention my name, but I'm going to put myself in there as well, because I'm sure you wanted to do that.
I also teach you. I'm sorry. I just figured you were going to do it yourself. I teach your work as well, sir.
I appreciate that, and of course, I'm just kidding with you. But the fact is that you are a part of this movement, and so no doubt that PA students will be reading your work as well. And I am pleased that you're continuing this path, and that's what you're saying in that message in your comments. That we all have a role to play, specifically if we're scholars and public administration, right? Because some of our best journals have not been particularly responsive to issues of the so and hopefully that is changing, and again, we're pleased that you are helping to push that along. So thank you very much for your comments. Greatly appreciate it. Outstanding. Finally, we're going to go on to Dr. Irizarry, who will respond to the same question, please.
So, thank you everyone for coming today and engaging in what I would consider to be a difficult conversation. I don't think many of us are trained at home in most environments on having these conversations, not just about race, but essentially about disagreement. It's hard to say specifically what can we do as public administrators to make these ethical principles more realized, because our field is so diverse and we work with so many different people with so many different backgrounds. So we may not necessarily agree. So that's probably where I would start. Let's create an environment or a space where disagreements are encouraged. I was just at the NASPA conference, excellent conference, by the way, first time they did it virtually. And Laura Bloomberg said something that stood out to me, which was that we should enable an environment for good trouble. Let's call disagreements good trouble. Being able to disagree in a safe space could facilitate actual discussion between individuals, especially when they don't agree. I also think that inviting these other perspectives that don't necessarily align with yours and carefully considering them, listening to them, also shows that we recognize our humanity, our shared humanity, and the individual lived experiences of those involved. In my classes, I generally tell my students when we have these, difficult conversations, when we're dealing with wicked problems, that they are not allowed to attack the person. If they don't agree, don't attack the person. Focus on the logic of their claims. You can attack the support that they use for their claims, but we are all entitled to our opinions. We are all entitled to have a certain understanding of something, and it may not be that particular individual's fault if they were misinformed, or if they don't have all of the information. But if you attack the person, you're never going to get anywhere. It doesn't facilitate that discussion. I also tell my students, and I would say that as practitioners, we should do the same with whoever we coach and mentor and teach, that they need to be encouraged to reflect. They need to reflect on what is it that they are presented with. They need to reflect on what that particular thing may mean to them, as well as how others may see that particular thing, or what meaning or significance that particular thing may have to others. And then if there are differences, I challenge my students to consider what are those differences and try to figure out why they exist. They don't necessarily have to agree with the other positions, but I think this again helps to recognize the lived experiences of different people. And it creates an environment where you can disagree, but still move the conversation forward. I think that related to what was said before, the idea of what values we stand for, what values we uphold are extremely important. And I think that Kareem mentioned it when he focused on the intentionality of, how do we do these things and when we do them. And I think that as scholars and practitioners, and especially teachers, we need to look at what the values are we stand for, but also how we're conveying them, how we're transferring meaning to the next generation, to our colleagues. And I think that when we do that, we also have to figure out how to make those values that we are communicating as significant actionable. Because it's not enough just to say that we value these things, but working in systems, and almost every system has inconsistencies and contradictions, whether those contradictions are because of your multiple roles or the various rules that exist, or maybe even different constituencies. We need to train the next generation on how to make the values actionable, even when confronted with systems or confined by systems that may be inconsistent. So I think I would just end this by saying that we should always ask ourselves and ask others, are we practicing what we preach? And when it concerns our students, are we developing them to effectively do the same?
Good, thank you, Dr. Irizarry. That was really quite astute. And this notion of tensions, perhaps good tensions, right? It came out so clearly in your comments, and I agree with you. I do think that having difficult conversations is not what people often think of as a good time, right? But those difficult conversations around the other is so important, right? So whether that's around racism, sexism, sexual orientation, ableism, whatever the case is, we need to all come to the table and as you sagely mentioned, listen, right? Listen and talk. And I think that is such a great thing. But while I have you, I'm going to now go to another conversation, and here's where I want the panelists to roll up their sleeves and to think about what we can do, right? Because oftentimes in these types of seminars and webinars, we have great philosophical questions, but the audience leaves wanting to know, well, how can we move this along? How can we do this, right? And so the question for you is, what is a technique you use to teach DEI, whether in the classroom or another public service agency? And before you speak, let me also say that I know that we have questions already being populated in the chat room. Patricia is doing a great job of monitoring that, and we will make sure that we save a considerable amount of time to answer each of those questions. So, Jose.
Sorry, I was on mute. So questions for me. So it's hard to pick a particular technique because they are somewhat interrelated, but I always go down to, I guess the foundation is going to be reflection and critical thinking. In my classes, it's not, I don't, it's written in my syllabus or in my syllabi, I don't want my students to regurgitate information. I don't need you to tell me what's in the textbook because chances are I already read it several times. So I'm good. But I want to know what the particular content means to them and how they can apply it. So a technique that I use, especially in the online class environment, is, I guess it's considered one of those high practices, high intensity or something, writing intensive. I make my students address the issue by writing or examining the same issue from multiple perspectives. And I give them a break, and then we come back to that same perspective so that they have that opportunity to reflect on the previous conclusions that they reached to see if they want to self-correct or if they want to change course. Because the majority of the stuff that we deal with that would be wicked problems or the difficult conversations don't necessarily have a specific right or wrong answer. But so I think the critical reflection, that process, is what's going to help them in the future, whether in the classroom or professionally, etc. So that's what I would say is the one technique. It would be the reflection, and in my classes now that are online, I do it through writing intensive practices.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for that. Greatly appreciate it. We're going to go to Aaron now, who, Aaron, if you could respond to this question. We know that your students love you at the University of Louisville, and but what do you say about utilizing techniques of DEI in your classroom, and how does that pan out, please?
Yeah, so before we get to DEI, I think it's important. I think it's actually our moral obligation as educators to get our students and to correct a lot of the false narratives that they've been taught throughout history as children. I'll tell you a quick story real quickly. The University of Mississippi, people know this, but this was founded because prior to 1848, when it was founded, the white male elites in Mississippi were sending their children, not their children, sending their males, sending their male children to the Ivy League schools in the Northeast. And while there, those children were learning that this thing called race, it's a social construct. It's not real. I mean, they may look different, but there's nothing different about your children or their children. And so these guys were learning this stuff in the Ivy Leagues, and they were coming back to Mississippi, and they were saying, "Dad, you've been teaching us that these slaves are like wrong. That these slaves are different than us all these years." And they were eventually freeing some of the slaves. And once they took over the plantations, and so the guys in Mississippi got together and said, "No, we need to do something about these young men because this is our way of life." And so they created the University of Mississippi. I said that to say this. They've been always, there's these narratives that they want to teach, that they've been teaching. And I think it's our moral obligation to go in and show our students from the onset, hey, these narratives, they're false, they're incorrect. This guy, I think it's either coming up soon or it's about to come up. Christopher Columbus, he's not a good guy. George Washington, he's not a good guy. These are evil people. These are evil guys. Let's talk about, let's have honest conversations about history, first of all. So before we can get into those other conversations about DEI, let's talk about these, let's go in and debunk some of these myths that we have so often that our children have been taught. And then we can start dehumanizing the others, because we've been taught, and we've taught our children to dehumanize the others. If they're not like us, they're the others. So one of my favorite things to do on the first day of class is to come in and just take everything they've been taught and throw it in the trash. And of course, this is oftentimes met with, you can imagine how it's met, but I think that's so important. I think it's extremely important to tell the truth, tell the real stories, explain to them that we have these conversations about, I'll give you another example, gang violence. But then again, we call the forefathers heroes, and we name cities after our forefathers. But the duels that our forefathers were having are the same as the gang violence in the inner cities. They didn't like each other. They were mad about some issue. They took it to the streets, and what happened? They shot each other, Just the same ideas, but we dehumanize these inner city thugs, and we praise and name cities after these, people that we read about. So my first answer to that, or my first answer is we have to tell the truth. Let's go in and debunk some of the myths. And I don't want to take too much of the time, but I'll tell you one other thing I think we should do. Technique that I think we should do is stop diluting the message. When my head is hurting, I don't want a Band-Aid. Stop diluting the message. Stay on topic, address the topic at hand, and have those tough and uncomfortable conversations.
That is that's just lovely. While you were speaking, Dr. Rollins, at first I thought you were channeling one of my heroes, Dr. Cornel West, who's also one of our frat brothers. But I felt Cornel was in the room. So the story about Mississippi is so fascinating, because as a New Yorker, we grew up not knowing much about Mississippi except what we've heard, the lynchings and all of this kind of thing. So I think that was such a great story. And also your techniques are ones that certainly, I've employed them, as well as I'm sure many people on this panel, and they are often met with rebuke. So you're exactly right. And the question is, why? Why or is this teaching technique met with such disdain? So thank you very much for that, those insightful comments. And did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I actually want to challenge that, or explain it a little.
I'm sorry, Jose, before you challenge, and I certainly think that's great, but let me first finish off the rest of the panelists, and then we can come back to you, okay? Would that be fair? Okay, terrific.
Yes.
All right,
I'm
because I
looking
do
forward
want
to
to
it.
make
I
sure
want to
that,
hear it. Let's go.
yeah. I do want to move on to Dr. Love and give her an opportunity to respond, please.
Sure. Well, I think both Aaron and Jose have laid the foundation for this. And really, it's like, to me, it's a cornerstone of thinking about DEI, and it's the willingness or the commitment, from the beginning, the foundational commitment to engage honestly and openly, constructively in these difficult conversations, hard conversations, uncomfortable conversations, right? And to me, it's not only necessary for if we are going to actually move forward in social equity, or however we want to talk about it, but it's also it's an issue of integrity and respect, right, for the folks who are sitting in our classrooms to be willing to talk about hard truths. And at the same time, do it in a way that encourages empathetic listening, reflection, and building of trust and community, so that we can have productive conversations around this hard stuff. And then to do that, right, I would say I do that through fostering inclusive dialogue, providing detail about actual history and systemic injustice, right? Give some empirical data, and providing theoretical lenses through which to make sense of all of that, right? So inclusive dialogue means bringing in the voices in the room, but also bringing in voices who aren't in the room, right? Paying attention to who are we reading, who are we listening to, who is representing, who is talking about their own stories, right? So the examples I'm going to give are examples from my public management class. One of the readings that I have my students do is a chapter from Fogarty and Jen's Gender Ambiguity in the Workplace. I love the book because one of the authors is a trans woman of color, and they have gone out and they have interviewed trans, non-binary, gender fluid folks, and they are telling their own stories in their own words in the reading, as well as identifying potential solutions and workplace policies that could change to identify that. So it's that really inclusiveness of, like, not only do we get to hear their stories and have their words in the classroom as part of the discussion, but also they are offering the solutions and the ideas about the issues that are shaping their lives directly every day. Right. And then my hope is when we have diverse folks that we are reading, whether that's a blog, or we're watching a video, or there's music, or right, there's lots of different ways to bring voices into the classroom. So I try to be creative and expansive in that. And then hopefully that also gives, you know, folks in the classroom some resonance in the material, and shows, it demonstrates, right, through action, that I care about their perspectives, that their voice and their perspective and their experiences are honored in that space. The deeper detail, right, talk about actual systemic injustices as they have existed. One of the readings that I give is Al-Qadri, Blessed, and Patterson's Public Administration, Diversity, and the Ethic of Getting Things Done, and talking about the story of Overton, right? That story is repeated across the United States, right? That is one example of something that has happened to communities over and over and over again. But it's very detailed. It's a very explicit, you know, discussion about what happened, the processes, the organizations or the administrative agencies involved, and the, you know, the impacts on the community. And then for theoretical lenses, a couple of the ones I like to use are Patricia Hill Collins's Matrix of Domination, or you might want to look to her Domains of Power. Iris Marion Young's 5 Faces of Oppression. One that folks are probably familiar with is Terry Cross's Cultural Competency Continuum, which I think is good, but on its own, right? I think it needs the larger contextualization of thinking about the different manifestations of oppression, the different domains of power that Collins gives us. And so, like, to go back to what Jose was talking about, what I want to see is, can you take, looking at all of these different, you know, the perspectives that maybe you're not familiar with, right? You don't have firsthand experience with, details about actual history of systemic injustice, and a theoretical lens that helps you understand systems of power and oppression. And can you then take a case example, right? Like, I often have them examine their own organizations or an organization they've worked for in the past, or they want to, I'll provide them with a case study. And can you take, you know, these same tools of looking at experiences, empirical data and history, and theoretical lenses, and analyze what's happening. So that's the general approach I like to take in applying this stuff.
That's great, Dr. Love. You mentioned inclusive listening, which I think is so right on, and I'm not sure that many people know how to really do that well. So, you know, that deserves a conversation in and of itself. If we a little bit on, I think that's such a great piece. We're going to move on now to Kareem Willis. Kareem, if you would respond, please.
I was actually very excited about this question because I consider myself a very practical person. So I'm one of those people who come to the webinars looking for practical steps that I can take away from these kind of discussions and so on. And so I have a few, but I'll just highlight, I have a couple that I had listed, but I'll just highlight a few. I think one technique that is perhaps like underrated is figuring out how, as professors, as educators and scholars, we could model DEI within our classroom pedagogy and how we structure our classroom management techniques, right? And two of my colleagues, well, before I was a colleague, I remember learning from professors, right? Just looking at professors like Dr. Rachel Emas, who used her syllabus to kind of structure, and I'm not sure if that was her intention, but for going forward, I was able to use that to see how I could be more inclusive of my different students and different voices and different learning capabilities within the classroom. Same thing with another colleague, Kayla, who was able to make accommodations as much as she can, right? And for me, the bigger lesson or the bigger takeaway from those is understanding that people have different experiences, different backgrounds, and so on and so forth. And so I feel like those mini lessons get overlooked because they're not as significant, or they don't understand the impact that they might have. Another thing is, in my own classes and in preparing syllabi, I try to make equity and inclusion, diversity, equity, inclusion, more of a forethought as opposed to an afterthought. I don't want to talk about the topic and then say, okay, what are the equity, diversity, and inclusion implications and so on. And so for everything that I try to describe, every time I try to put together a syllabus, I'm looking at the equity implications and so on for different individuals and having that discussion up front, as opposed to at the end of class tacking it on to my syllabus, and if we get time then we'll discuss it. That's a part of the intentionality that I'm talking about. Another thing that I found very useful is really allowing the students or the participants, because I'm not just having class lectures, right? I'm also having discussions outside of the classroom, but also giving people the space to use the language that they already have to articulate their experiences with diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think we get so caught up in trying to, I'm going to use indoctrinate, right? And trying to teach them the scholarly terms and the academic jargon, that we really forget that people already have experiences with some of these systems of oppression, right? Already have their own experiences with diversity and equity and inclusion. And so they can very well articulate what's happening. And then we can also say, okay, well, this is how you make that connection to something like intersectionality and so on and so forth. And in doing that, I also welcome the kind of challenges and uncomfortable conversations or challenging conversations that might come up. And I'll say a quick story before I hand it over. I was doing a webinar on intersectionality a few weeks ago, and one of the individuals came in. We were talking about intersectionality in the LGBTQ community, and his response was that, I don't want to be bothered with all these labels. I feel like these labels just serve to further divide us and cause more struggles and yada, 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 as opposed to really doing what it takes away from what we're trying to achieve. And in that moment, I could have easily said, you know what, I think that's your opinion, and kept it moving. But I thought that was a teachable moment for us to have that conversation about, okay, in this instance, I can understand your argument, but in this instance, those labels are important because we need to understand how different individuals, right, experience oppression and so on. And so I think most of what has already been said, but I think really just acknowledging those conversations and not backing down from those conversations would really help to move the needle forward until we get to a space where it is commonplace and it is social DEI is the norm in our classrooms or in our public agencies.
Thank you, Kareem. Willis. This notion of intentionality is certainly something that that we are grappling with, right, as a field of public administration and policy, and specifically as members of the social equity movement. And so I do think it's important, and I absolutely 100% agree with you on that. And very much like this notion of inclusive listening, you know, if we have time, we'll unpack that a little bit more if we can. So thank you so much. That was a great response. Greatly appreciated. And we'll finally finish up this question with Dr. Lopez-Littleton, and if you would respond, please.
Yes, I'll try to be somewhat brief, but I do agree with my colleagues, and I love this idea about deconstructing or demystifying truths about Black folks, because I think it's one of the challenges that we have in our society, is that a lot of people don't understand the history and the oppression, the systemic issues that we've experienced. And so I also wanted to note that I do train my students on engaging in difficult conversations using conflict negotiation and critical dialogue processes. I've pretty much moved away from textbooks. I used to rely on them heavily. And so what I found is that this actually makes education more affordable and accessible to a larger number of students. And one of the things that I'm looking forward to doing in my department is moving towards not having any additional costs associated with the major. And so that's going to be a major hurdle, I know. And so my comment is on one of the techniques that I use in my classroom is the inclusion of contemporary media to bring additional voices in the room. And I think that's something Jeannine was talking about. So I use music as a way of talking about resistance to oppression, using art, street art in cities and communities, and the power of those resistant movements in real time, because a lot of the things that are painted on buildings and on sides of walls and, you know, in some of the alleyways are about things that are happening right now. And so it's a critical way and an insightful way to understand the context of what's happening in society. For some strange reason, I've been writing and talking and thinking a lot about sagging pants, which are clothing items. And so one of the reasons that I do that is because a couple of years ago, and then still currently, there are policymakers who are making policies about sagging pants. And, you know, as public administrators, we should definitely push back against that, because that's not okay. And so, yeah, but I'll drop an article that I was cited in the chat, so I won't keep yapping about that.
That's awesome.
But then the other quick things are, I have students read Just Mercy by Brian Stevens, and they also watch Icebox, which is an immigration story. It's also on HBO. I'll drop a free link in the chat as well, because it helps them to understand the context of what some people in this country experience at the hands of public servants. And so using tools like the racial dot map to let people know how the United States is a very segregated nation, and there are tremendous opportunities to resolve that, but it will take some intentional efforts. And this particular EO that I mentioned earlier that came out of the president's office, it really seeks to undermine all of the efforts that we've been doing to advance racial and social justice. So I'll stop my yapping there. Thanks.
Oh, that's great, Vanessa, and thanks so much for the resources. I'm sure that Patricia will capture all of that for everyone, and we'll look forward to, like, I had not heard about some of the things that you cited, so I'm excited to go back and now dig into them. So thank you, I greatly appreciated that. And so I've just been signaled by Patricia that we have 3 questions so far in the chat room. I would like to encourage the audience, if there are questions that they would like answered, if they could put those in the chat now, that would be great. What I would like to do, if it's okay with the panel, is to go back to Jose, who wanted to push back a little bit on what Aaron was saying. And then after that, I did have an additional question. However, I think I would like to open it up for audience questions. So, okay, so Jose?
Thank you. Before I do that, because it's fresh in my head, I want to say thank you to Vanessa for highlighting the utility of moving away from textbooks to make education more accessible. I think the cost of books are far too expensive, having just, had to read so many of them. But in that same thing, I think that we should also consider that doing that, moving away from a textbook, allows you to bring in more perspectives, especially those that may be underrepresented in certain areas. I think it gives the team member much more in that way. It's a way for you to help the students focus what they learn, because they could focus on interest areas. And I think that's more meaningful to them. What I generally try to do this semester, for instance, I didn't rely on a textbook here because of the pandemic. I wasn't sure about delivery and if they were going to get it, etc. So what I did was I found an older textbook by Peter Drucker, written in 1990. And so they're reading something from 30 years ago, but I contrast that with not only different perspectives, but perspectives over time, so that the students get to compare and contrast essentially opposing viewpoints, but also how these points may develop over time. And I think that is meaningful to their learning, and it helps them retain it. Now, back to Aaron and the contention, I kind of have a problem, as it was mentioned earlier. I'm from New York City, and I also grew up in foster care. I have been considered one of the most liberal people everywhere. And I don't consider myself a liberal. I just consider myself, a thinker. I analyze and overanalyze. And if that's the conclusion I reach, that's the conclusion I reach at that particular time. But having lived in Florida now, and I'm in Mississippi today, and I moved to Illinois recently, I've been encountering a bunch of different people. And one of the things that they're saying, especially about academia, about college, is they're lumping all of higher education as liberal, even K through 12 sometimes. And I had to listen to what they were saying, because again, I want to respect their individual lived experiences. And essentially what it comes down to is they feel that higher education is a form of manipulation or brainwashing. Because we are essentially telling them when they come in that their lived experience, that everything that they have known has been wrong and is wrong, and it must stop. So what I have tried to do is reflect on that. Again, I want to respect their lived experience, and I don't want to be accused of oppressing them. If I was part of the oppressed class and I'm trying to stop oppression, are we doing the same thing when we start off by telling them that they're wrong? So I actually would propose a question to the panel and to the attendees to consider what's more effective or meaningful. Is it telling someone essentially that I'm right and you're wrong, even if you can prove, why you're right? Or is it more effective or meaningful to help guide them along a path so that they can reach a conclusion, whether we agree with it or not, but so that they can stand by it with good evidence, not just because that's just how I feel.
Okay, thank
because
you.
we don't want to be accused of oppressing others.
Right, I appreciate that. Thank you, Jose, for that insightful remark. We're going to give Dr. Rollins an opportunity to respond, and I'm sure that everyone on the panel would love to respond to that, but instead of that, because I know the panel, instead of that, we're going to open it up to the audience so that they can have their questions answered. So, Aaron, please, Dr. Rollins.
Yes, I would never apologize for telling the truth. I don't want so I want to start off by saying that I think it's our moral obligation, I'll say that again, to tell our students the truth. These students don't know what they don't know. They're ignorant most of the time. And sometimes they're stupid, but most of the time they're just ignorant. And we all are ignorant in some things, in some manners. I'll tell you one example. I didn't know the third stanza or the second stanza of the Star Spangled Banner until Colin Kaepernick. I didn't realize that stanza that talks about the heirlooms and the slaves and all of they were not freed, and they were bragging on that until Colin Kaepernick. I think it's important to stick to what you know is right, and to be able to go to bed at night knowing that you did the right thing. And the right thing is to tell these students the truth and have those difficult conversations, but do it in truth as opposed to doing it and trying to make them feel good. I think that's the obligation that we have as educators.
So let me suggest this. I know that Jose would love to respond as well, but I'm a scholar, so I'm always thinking about new research projects. So I would like to suggest that this is perhaps a journal article that you both can write with discussing this tension, right? I think that would really actually be quite fabulous. So something for you both to think about as you go through your day and your weeks to come. But I think it really is a topic that's worthy of conversation because, I'm sure even on the panel, people have different or varying opinions about that one specific piece. So, okay. So thank you both for that. Patricia, if we could open up for questions now.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So we are getting some wonderful questions, and I also want to encourage everyone to send your questions to me directly by chat. And to get us started, the first question for the panelists would be, so much of what is taught about DEI, including in PA, is superficial. Are we ready for, and how do we advance radical, should be normative, ideals of authentic, intentional action, such as Dr. Bettina Love's work of abolitionist theory? And I'll post that in the chat as well.
Wow, that is such a powerful question. Panelists, who would like to take that, please?
Can we see the question again?
Yeah.
That was a loaded question.
I can't see the questions. I don't know if
yes, it's coming. One moment. Yes.
Thank you.
I'll take an initial try. Well,
yes, Dr. Love, please.
I would echo that. I mean, I feel like, I'll just circle back around to kind of my initial answer is, you know, about discussion of social equity and sometimes even our approaches to DEI work as being somewhat superficial, right? It's sort of checking a box of like, we talked about social equity, or we talked, you know, we considered some minor process of inclusion. This kind of gets a little bit at my answer for the third question too, is that like, we'll do something, we'll check a box and we'll say we did it. We did the DEI stuff and now we're done, right? Without naming, right? Without being explicit, without really digging into the issues, without putting into place actual participatory processes that are an ongoing institutionalized thing, right? That really allows us to look internally at the culture of our organizations, bring everyone into the conversation, and have an ongoing commitment to doing real social equity, real racial justice, you know, et cetera, work inside our organizations. So I think to make DEI work more or less superficial, we need to have more explicit terminology. And then B, we need to have buy-in, particularly in leadership in organizations, that will say like, this is institutionalized, this is part of what we do, this is an ongoing process that is purposefully, intentionally, thoughtfully designed to be inclusive and participative and ongoing, right? Because we'll never, this is work that is never done.
Great response. Anyone else on the panel? Yes, Dr. Lopez-Littleton, please.
Yeah, is that from Welcome Back, Carter, when, you know, the students get excited? Yeah, that's the way I feel. So yeah, so I'm looking at this question. I initially thought the person was saying that DEI was superficial, but it's like the way that it's taught. One of the things that is tricky, it's that there's a lack of diversity in higher education. And so there's a lack of diversity as a consequence in public administration and people who are teaching these types of classes. And so, you know, I think there's going to be an inherent issue there. In California, the governor signed AB 1460, which is an ethnic studies requirement now for all CSU students. California State University students. So beginning next year, all incoming freshmen and moving forward will have to take an ethnic studies course. So even students in our public administration concentration will have to have this ethnic studies course. And so one of the things that I try to do is to, and that's the reason I use media, use music, art, and try to bring in all these different you know, kind of avenues of learning, is to promote that deeper level of understanding and awareness. And very quickly, my department, we're putting together what's called an engaged scholarship model, where not only do we talk about these things in the classroom, but we also have an opportunity, because of all of our students do, you know, internship, learning that relates to not only things related to our program, but related to diversity, equity, inclusion, which is a critical part. That racial and social justice is a critical part of the things that we teach. And so I think that this will be, like Dr. Johnson said, a wonderful opportunity to write an article to talk about how we're establishing this program so that it does further a deeper level of understanding and awareness and engagement with the community. So I'm excited about that. Thank you.
So thank you so very much. And I know that other panelists want to respond, but I do want to make sure that we get as many questions in as possible. So Patricia, if we could have the second question, please.
Absolutely, and I'll paste it here first. That's easy.
Great.
So DEI has the spotlight. How do we maximize effectiveness and accomplish the great impact on policy and practices? Is streamlining our issues into one or two major focuses, such as policing and access to wealth, more effective than trying to tackle every issue right now?
Wow, I'm not exactly sure who's asking these questions, but they are hitting them out of the park. Very impressive. Panelists who would like to take this first, please. I think that in order to be fair, perhaps we should give those who didn't answer the second question I'm sorry, the last question, an opportunity to answer this. And if they don't want to respond, then we can go on to our colleagues that just spoke.
So yes, I'll take the first crack at it. I'm all about this. I think it was King who said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." So there are always oppression in multiple facets. But when there's as I said earlier, when I have a headache, I don't want a band-aid. I think when there's an issue at hand, I think it's important to attack and address that issue. And it's okay to bring in different oppressed individuals or different oppressed groups, but I think it's important to stick to the message. I think it's important to stay focused and stick to the message at hand. And that's probably, in my opinion, the best way to address the issues, DEI issues, is stick to the one or the more pressing issues at hand, but
Good.
never promoting oppression on any of the other oppressed individuals or groups.
Great, thank you so much. Kareem, Willis, do you want to chime in?
Sure. It's funny because that was the first half of this question is what I was going to respond to the second question, that, you know, the time is right now to kind of really advance some of these work and to there's no, well, people will still try, but we ought to stop demonizing DEI work and so on. But the second half of the question really has me kind of struck, because I remember when everything started happening with George Floyd and everything, and a colleague of mine, we started having conversations about what is our responsibility as scholars, as students in this moment, right? And how do we begin to execute those responsibilities and duties? And honestly, I really don't have an answer to the question, except that I think we really should be strategic about how we focus on some of these issues. And for me, it's difficult to kind of parse through one particular issue or to put one above the other, whatever the case may be, which is not what the question is asking. But when I think of like intersectionality and think about my own experience, right, as an immigrant, as a Black, openly queer identified individual, it's hard for me to say, okay, let's focus on racism right now in this moment, because on any given day, I cannot separate my identities. I do agree with Dr. Rollins to an extent, but I guess I'm just stuck on how do we move forward. I think now that a lot of stuff is coming to the surface, it's giving us an opportunity to really parse through them and really to sit and focus on them. But in terms of focusing on just one or deeming that strategy more effective, I'm not quite sure I agree with that.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. I greatly appreciate your insights. And
May I speak to that?
Yes, Dr.
Really quickly.
Rollins.
So
Yep.
I agree with, I completely understand where you're coming from, Kareem. And Du Bois talked about this in double consciousness, and then Patricia Hill Collins came in later on and talked about this when she talked about the triple consciousness, you know, and female to it. I think it's important to never oppress and never support oppression to any group. But I think when the time is right, it's important to focus on the issue. I want to be very clear. I think it's important when the time is right to focus on the issue or the major issue at hand. And I think currently, right now, the time is on race. So that's my position.
Well, again, I think here's an opportunity for a great paper to be written, right? And by the time the panel leaves this webinar today, they'll have multiple ideas for papers and people to write with. I think it's very exciting, and maybe even the panel would want to write something together. As you all know, I'm the king of symposia, and I'm always running symposium in some journal. Which, that said, we do have a journal, a PAR symposium coming out that was led by myself and Dr. Gooding and Dr. James Berry. So, and that's on what would King do, Martin Luther King, in the pursuit of justice. And so that it's been about a 2-year journey for that symposium, but that will be coming out shortly. So, so pay attention, look out for that as well. We have only 10 minutes, and Patricia, I don't know how many more questions we have in the chat room.
So only a couple more, and I do have one that I think we could fit in,
Okay.
and that is, I'll put that in the chat, which is, can a public servant be considered ethical if that individual does not seek to advance SETI principles within their area of work.
Wow. Okay, that's again another great question. Jose, I know you didn't get a chance to respond to the last couple of questions. Do you want to start off with that, please?
Yes, thank you. And
Thank you.
the simple answer I would say is no. And that's because I don't think you can have things like justice if you violate and infringe upon the social equity, diversity, and inclusion. If you're not respecting my humanity or my lived experience or treating me, I don't want to say equally, but fairly, no, then I don't believe that could be ethical. But ultimately, I guess it depends on what ethical standard you are considering at that particular time.
Okay, awesome, thank you. Would someone else like to respond, please? Anyone else want to take that? Okay. All right. So then, Parisha, we'll go on to the next question, please.
Okay, certainly. So let me just pull that up. Okay. One moment here. And to what degree, and I'll piece it momentarily, to what degree, if any, are oppressors going unnamed due to special interest groups, such as organizations with questionable values, and how do we address them?
Wow. Wow, another powerful question. Okay, who would like to take that, please? Dr. Lopez-Littleton, please.
I'm like, wait a minute, what? So, yeah, so it's interesting. I know you guys don't know me, but my personality is not to necessarily call people out, but I do think that there's power in being able to name a problem. And so my background is in nursing. And so when you go in to take care of a patient, you need a diagnosis. You don't just go in there and try to figure out what's going on. You have a diagnosis and then you work to alleviate or to provide some remedy for that particular issue or concern. And so I think the problem, America has a deep racial issue. Like we really can't talk about racial issues. And so with the, one of my fears is without a national strategy around racial and social justice, I'm afraid it doesn't, kind of cut the mustard. We're not able to get there to have enough of these deep conversations going on at the same time in a real way. And so what I will encourage people to do is not to focus at the lack of effort at the national level, but to consider what can happen within your state and within your local communities. So if we don't have a national conversation around race, maybe these are things that we can do in the state or even in your local municipalities. So I know I've been working with some of my local city government talk about some of these. One of my mentors, Dr. Mara Jones, who does a lot of work in public health, she's been calling out racism in the healthcare system for more than 20 years. And she just has this great body of work, but public health has been very slow to respond to it. And so now with the pandemic and what we see happening to Black and other people of color and even Indigenous people as it relates to COVID and how it impacts them as individuals and as a community, I just think that there is such an opportunity that we're missing by not addressing this in a real and systemic way. So one of the things that I would encourage public administrators to do is to reach out to public health, reach out to law enforcement, reach out to these other disciplines to see how we can leverage that collective power to begin to have these critical conversations to advance racial and social justice. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent, excellent comment. Would anybody else like to chime in? Okay. Dr. Littleton, if I could just follow up with you for just a second, how would you then say that universities and colleges have a place in this conversation that we're having, or do they? Because we know that most universities are inherently conservative in their approach, right? So what would you say to that?
Well, I'm going to focus on some of the work that I do with nonprofit organizations. And one of the things that I've been doing over the past 2 years is encouraging them to work with researchers in institutions of higher education. So not just universities, but also community colleges, because within these institutions, what you'll find is that there are a lot of folks who have been thinking and existing in this space for a while. And so even though the institution as a whole may be leaning one way or the other, I think that identifying particular researchers or people who work for the Office of Inclusive Excellence or Diversity, Equity, offices, they also are a wealth of information and a resource to their communities. So being able to reach out to some of the practitioners, some of the faculty, some of the other scholars to begin to think about in real time the issues that are affecting your communities. When I lived in Florida, I lived in Orlando, but I worked with the city of Sanford after the killing of Trayvon Martin there to understand some of the disadvantages that were going on to some of the African-American communities. And so it was a really good opportunity to be engaged in an opportunity, with the people who lived in that city, who were so invested in it, but then who, have for so long have been divested. And so how does the city respond in a real way to begin to think about equity so that the people who've been disadvantaged or disenfranchised for so long have opportunities, have that equality of opportunity to get ahead. And so I say that there's tremendous opportunities for partnership and engagement with colleges and universities. Thank you.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. And on that note, panelists, we have just a couple of minutes, and I would like for each of the panelists to give us a 20-second panelist closing comment on our topic today. And again, feel free to just jump in there. But if you go more than 20 seconds, I will cut you off. So please keep that in mind. Okay. So Vanessa, we'll start with you.
Oh, okay. During the first 2020 presidential debate, Chris Wallace asked Trump, "Why did you end racial sensitivity training? And do you believe there is systemic racism in this country?" And Trump replied, "I ended it because it is racist." I want to be clear, this is not a left-right issue. Systemic racism is an ethical issue and something that if we work together, we can begin to systemically and strategically dismantle. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Was well done in 20 seconds. Okay, I appreciate that. Okay, Jose, please.
So I think that the takeaway that I've taken from most of these conversations is that what we're lacking or losing is a sense of shared experience, whether that's a community, a family, a sense of brotherhood or sisterhood. Without that shared experience, it's very hard to understand that other. So we continue to otherize, and most people tend to be fearful or avoid other. So I think if we can create more shared experiences, perhaps we can move forward in a good way.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Really appreciate that. Jeannine, please.
Sure. I'm going to bounce mine off of the comment that didn't get addressed that's in the chat, which is, do we need a both and approach? Both sort of this universal globalistic looking at how systems of domination and power work versus also looking at the specificities of social identities and lived experience. And I think that's an important takeaway to emphasize, is that we do need that both and approach. That's why it's important to look at things like the theoretical lenses that give us the tools to identify and understand how systems of power and oppression work. And then also give us the contextualized tools to understand what Kareem was talking about earlier with the intersectionality and how these systems of oppression are interwoven with one another and mutually reinforcing, that makes it really difficult to tease anyone out, right? So if we want to look at, say, for instance, trans issues and race at the same time, right, we can look at that intersection and call both of those forms of oppression out through the example of specific lived experiences. So we do think that we need to have both that larger theoretical lens and then also the lived experience to understand the shared humanity, as was nicely said.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Aaron?
Yes, thank you all for hosting this panel. Audre Lorde told us in 1983 that there is no hierarchy of oppressions. I wanted to keep that in mind as we move forward, have these conversations, but if my house is on fire, don't tell me that your yard needs cutting. I want to make sure that we stay focused, stay strategic, and really address the issues at hand.
Great, thank you so very much. And we'll keep that in mind. Audre Lorde was certainly a prophet in her day, and her words are still needed today. Finally, Kareem?
Thank you. And thank you again, DSJ, ASPA DSJ, for having me. I think it was Iyanla Vanzant. I'm a big fan of her that says you can't really grow and heal from what you don't acknowledge. And I think we are at that critical point where we really need to acknowledge a lot of the things that has been, have been hindering our growth here in public administration. I think we really do have the tools and the scholars, as evident by everybody here, to really get the needle moving on some of these things. Other sectors have done it, other industries have done it. Hollywood is starting to take note of their own faults. So I really do think that we can take advantage of some of the examples that we have around us to really start advancing DEI within our discipline.
Excellent. Thank you so very much. And to the panelists, I say thank you all for giving of your time and your talents and your great insight. This was an excellent panel. I do want to thank Patricia. She was just awesome. And of course, our audience that participated today. This was probably one of the greatest webinars I've had an opportunity to participate in. Also, Patricia, I don't know if there are any additional questions in the chat that weren't answered, but if there are, perhaps you can email those to the panelists for a response and then get those responses back to the individuals that asked the questions.
Yes, I would be happy to do that. And I want to just thank the wonderful panelists and you, Dr. Johnson, for such a thought-provoking panel. And I'd like to acknowledge and celebrate a career milestone of yours, Dr. Johnson. I don't know if everyone is aware, but Dr. Johnson has been officially appointed as a fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration, or NAPA. And this distinction recognizes your incomparable positive impact on the field of public administration. So just want to acknowledge and uplift and celebrate all that you do. And just thank you very much to you.
Thank you.
Carissa?
Yes. Oh, yes, please, go ahead.
May I add that he is also a candidate for the next president-elect of ASPA. And we are supporting him, and we wish him the best. And we know that you will lead this organization well. We know that you'll get it.
Thank you. Thanks.
That is fabulous. Thank you for sharing that. Here. And to close us out, I'd like to just briefly share our DSJ statement that released in June. And I just want to briefly highlight that we at DSJ recognize that equitable change requires hard work. As champions for diversity and advocates for inclusion, we believe in the principles and as the highest purpose of public service is to improve lives, we must ensure that the benefits of public administration, not just its burdens, are equitably advanced and afforded to all. And so this work is quite mighty. And it requires all of us to go all in. And we are just so appreciative of everyone who continues to support our work and to join our work. And let's keep fighting this good and important fight. Thank you all for joining. Any last words, Dr. Johnson?
No, again, thank you to this amazing panel, and to you, Patricia, for doing such an excellent job. As you always do, it's not a surprise. You always do an excellent job. So, but we're so appreciative of your talents, and to our great organization, ASPA, that allows us this space of having discussions on these critical and difficult topics. So kudos to ASPA and kudos to DSJ. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming. We had great participation today with over 40 people, and we're just excited to continue the conversations. And remember, panelists, if you would consider writing something on the topic. Okay, so thank you all very much, and thank you, Patricia. That's it for me.
Thank you, everyone.
Take
Have a
care.
wonderful day, everyone.